to newsagents.
And welcome to British Columbia as you join the CBC's coverage of Election 93. I'm Peter Mansbridge. This has been a night unlike any other in Canadian political history. The Liberals, who've held power almost 64 years this century, are going to hold it again. You could count Tory seats on your fingers. This is what the country's map looks like. Red, the color of the Liberal Party. Look at those swashes of red. The Tories, the lowest they've ever done in popular vote, 17%. You saw what it meant in seats, 3.
That was the Canadian federal election of 1993, and you heard the prediction there of just 3 Tory seats remaining. Well, that was wrong. There were only 2.
Yeah. So they went from 156 seats to just 2. It was catastrophic. But we're not doing this to delve into the depths of Canadian politics. We're just asking the question, could something similar happen here in this general election? Not so far-fetched when you look at the latest polling data, which puts Reform neck and neck with the Tories. Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis. And this poll, if the Tories had an attack of the collywobbles before, this would have turned them into absolute quivering jelly. Because the worst nightmare, that Reform comes along and is strong enough to deny the Tories their seats in the Red Wall and elsewhere, is coming to reality, it seems, if this polling data is to be released. And we put in all the usual caveats on polls. The only poll that matters is election day. There's a 3% plus or minus margin of error. Nevertheless, this will put the fear of God into the Tory party.
Yeah, and it's a mainstream polling company. It's YouGov. And I think that is relevant because you will have heard people sort of cross-reference different polls over the last few months. I think this is a pretty mainstream company doing polling on a large sample for the Times newspaper. And essentially it has Labour on 44%, as you've heard, the Conservatives on 19%, just slipping, Reform UK creeping up on 15%, and the Lib Dems on 9%, sort of not moving anywhere. And so you are starting to entertain, with all John's caveats in place, but you are starting to entertain the idea that the Conservatives might not just stop being the party of government, but they might stop being the main opposition party. It is virtually unthinkable that that could happen in the space of one parliamentary cycle from a majority of 80 in 2019. But these numbers are playing with our mind to a place where we start to think like that.
Yeah, and there's lots of immediate effects of this, which is that it is just one poll, as John said. But if you look at the trend is clear. Labour have been ahead basically since the end of 2021. They've been massively ahead since the end of 2022. The Conservatives have been continuing to decline, and since Sunak took over, there was a brief period of recovery, and they've been going down and down and down. And Reform, who it has to be said, actually when it's come to actual elections, haven't actually done that brilliantly. They did okay in Wellingborough. They did a little bit better than their national polling would suggest, but generally speaking, they've been underperforming by comparison to their performance in the polls. But their trend is up in all of the polls. And that has a profound psychological effect on the Conservative Party and Conservative MPs. And, I suppose there's different ways you could look at it, which is you could say, if you were being very optimistic in number 10, you could say, well, that 15% is still a percentage of voters that we can mine when it comes to the general election. And first past the post, which we know is a hell of a drug, when it comes down to it, both the Labour and Conservative parties can say, you can vote whoever you like. But ultimately, that just gives the keys to number 10 to the opposition, in this case, Keir Starmer. So that's, they could potentially mine into that 15%. But also looking at it the other way with the numbers in that poll as well. I mean, actually, if you add up Labour, 44, Lib Dems, 9, Greens, 8, that is a non-conservative, what you can broadly say is a progressive-ish kind of coalition of over 60 points. I mean, that is lethal, actually. That alone, never mind Reform. That, if you assume tactical voting comes into consideration, that itself is just a profound problem for the Conservative Party. And that has been reflected in poll after poll, basically since Boris Johnson days.
Yeah, and I think the problem with this is, and I'm going to quote Chris Hope here, who's a GB News reporter, but made a very interesting point ahead of this poll coming out that the Conservatives probably aren't scared of this election. I mean, they kind of, this is written in the waters from everything that we know. If the election were held tomorrow, it's done. They're more worried about the next election, because if they end up on something that looks like 19%, then it's very hard to see how the party stays together in one coalition. Immediately, you're starting to say, well, surely if all we've got to offer the country is less than 1 in 5 voters, right? Then isn't there a right Tory party and a moderate Tory party, a centrist Tory party and an uber sort of reform Tory party? We're actually talking about something existential for the party itself at that point.
There is another factor to put into all of this, and that is Nigel Farage, because at present, the head of Reform is Richard Tice. Now, kind of in Westminster, he's known, on the fringes of politics, he's known. He's not a national figure in this country in the way that Farage is. If Farage steps up and becomes the leader of Reform, fresh from I'm a Celebrity, the Jungle Experience, fresh from his battle with Coots and getting rid of, getting his bank account back and all the rest of it, he's had a pretty good year publicity-wise. I think that would give Reform another boost in the polls if Farage decides...
Without doubt.
Exactly.
Without doubt.
And so then you have got a real force against the Conservative Party in the forthcoming election, which, although, as you say, Lewis, because of first past the post, it might not be that Reform win any seats, or if they do win any seats, it's very few in number. But they are powerful enough to deprive the Conservatives of dozens of seats where the Conservative vote goes to Reform, it splits the Tory vote, and Labour comes through.
Well, we know the comparison, don't we? I mean, it's a bit of a tedious game for lots of reasons. People always compare the coming election to previous
saying
elections.
I'm being tedious?
No, not you, John. Never you. You're one of the most exciting people I know. But people always get in. Is it like 97? Is it like 2010? Let's just play the game for a moment. I mean, obviously, if Reform were to stick at these sort of levels, the election, it might end up looking more like, if anything, is 1983. Because what happens in 1983? You have a breakaway, in this case from the Labour Party in the form of the SDP. They actually come within a whisker of overtaking the Labour Party in percentage terms for their trouble. They only get a smattering of seats, 20, 30 or so. But obviously it's one of the factors, not the only factor by any means, which helps Margaret Thatcher secure an enormous 144-seat majority. In the meantime, there is another effect, it seems to me, that will manifest itself. If Reform keep polling at this sort of level, and even more so if, and people are whispering about it, the Conservative Party, if there is a poll which shows they overtake the Conservatives, which could happen, then the net effect in terms of the balance of politics within the Conservative Party is to push Sunak, or indeed whoever it is, to the right, which is exactly, of course, what happened with UKIP and Cameron in the sort of early 2010s. Because what people will say is, well, look, there is 14, 15, 20% of the electorate that are backing Reform. They are to the right of us. We must secure them back. And so the net effect is to shift, I'm sure, over the next few months, assuming this trend holds, will be to shift politics of the Conservative Party further to the right.
Yeah, because the Conservatives can't fight the Liberal alliance of 60% that you've just described. Sam Freeman, actually, who used to work with Michael Gove in government, got really interesting sort of breakdowns on some of the numbers. And this is to do with, generational voting, that the Conservatives have only 10%, just over 10% of the under 50s, right? So immediately, you've lost everyone under 50. Everyone between the age of 18 and 50 is pretty much not voting Tories. They are just 2 points ahead of the Green. And in the north, because this is also going to be a geographical breakdown, I think, Reform are beating the Tories amongst men, right? So if you're a man in the north, Reform is your more likely option than Conservative if you don't want to vote Progressive. They're 6 points behind amongst over 65s. So old, northern, presumably majority white, I'm going to say, men are already voting Reform over Conservative, according to this latest poll.
It is astonishing, these numbers. I suppose, Lewis, you a moment ago talked about, well, there are Reform votes to be mined for the Tories. I suppose the other factor is that Reform, UKIP, Vote Leave do well in European elections, or did well in European elections, when Europe was really a single issue. What is Reform's policy on benefits? What is Reform's policy on the health service? Where do Reforms stand on any number of issues, which sort of do play when it's a general election? And just to say we're going to send them back and we're going to tighten our borders, I'm not sure cuts it in a general election. And I think that's where you might start to see, if Reform, for example, are in a position where they're getting party election broadcasts and all the rest of it, if their polling is so good that the main broadcasters are having to consider giving them...
I don't know that's how it works, is it? I think your adverts have to come from your previous election result.
You know where...
So Reform doesn't exist as a party because it didn't exist as a party.
You know where they're being screwed here, ironically enough? By not having the European elections.
Of
if
course.
we were still in the EU, we would be in the European elections
because we have the
May.
D'Hondt form of voting in the European elections.
Exactly, we would be in the European elections in May. I mean, actually, and we can't underestimate this. Farage would always say this. You know, being part of the European Parliament was absolutely crucial in terms of UKIP's development, because obviously it was, and then the Brexit Party, they won a couple of those elections. If we were still in the European Union, then we would be part of the European elections in May, and Reform would probably beat the Conservative Party, and then they would be entitled to a load of extra party political broadcasts and all kinds of things. So there you go. Be careful what you wish for.
Maybe they campaign to take us back into the EU to then campaign to get us out of the EU in the general election.
Look, it's all about having the monster on the outside. And when we were in Europe, the EU was the monster on the outside. Now Europe's gone. The Conservatives are, if you like, the monster on the outside. Reform can define themselves by not being the Conservatives, not being the wishy-washy or the failed Conservatives or the party on the way down, because they see themselves with traction on the way up.
I mean, yeah, and John, I mean, to your point, actually, I mean, look, most of Reform's policies are, they're completely unworkable. I mean, they're talking about basically stopping all net migration. Or they're talking about, again, cutting taxes at the same time as increasing public spending in lots of different areas, right? And so, yeah, if we were actually looking at any prospect of Reform Party entering government, there would be problems. But again, this is the great advantage of any populist party, right? Farage always exploited this. If you look to the old UKIP manifestos, they got more professional over time, but particularly in the early days. Look, the truth is, most voters, we can sit and ask them about their policies all day long. But ultimately, the advantage of being on the outside is that they know that's irrelevant. They are a pressure valve on the Conservative Party and on people who wish to express discontent. And that is the joy of their perch, right? And it's unfair. And there'll be Tories who are like, well, this is not fair because these people are not subject to the same criticism or critique as we are. But it is how it goes.
One last thing about the Canadian election of 1993. It was held on the 25th of October. So I'm going to bet that anyone superstitious in government right now is staying away from that week very firmly in case comparisons are made.
Other Canadian 1993 trivia?
Yeah, it had two new parties.
Who was
Jean
Chrétien? Yeah, exactly.
Majority
and who was the Conservative leader who led them into disaster? Kim Campbell.
Yep.
Their only woman Prime Minister.
Disastrous.
Well, I don't think it was her. Do you know her constituent? Her riding.
Her riding.
Because
her riding is a constituency.
As I told you before we recorded, John.
Oh, just because you have spent the morning looking up Canadian trivia so that you could monster us in the studio.
Lovely to have nothing else to do, isn't it? The young.
No, the youth.
Well, just for your records, John, it was Vancouver Centre. And she lost it.
Well, I'm really
sorry,
pleased.
Kim.
I'm really pleased I know that. I mean, that will stay with me now.
Glad to be here.
Vancouver Central. Who knew? Well, we're joined now by Tom Lubbock, one half of JL Partners.
The L?
The L. Well spotted.
Yep. Yes.
The other one being James Johnson. Tom, look, it's lovely to have you with us. And I know this wasn't your poll, but does it cohere with other things that you've been reading and finding in your fieldwork?
It does completely. I mean, to some extent, we were the first out of the traps with this in November. We had a report out called Implosion in Blue, looking at how Reform was cannibalising that Conservative 2019 vote. And this is really just the culmination of that.
Could you see a scenario in which the Conservatives were no longer the main party of opposition?
I mean, it's bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers to think of it. But I think in this febrile age in which we are now in 2024, it's not inconceivable. If you go down and sit with voters and listen to what they're saying, Labour and Conservative supporters, previous Labour and Conservative supporters, they are just completely at sea. They don't know what to think or who to support now. They completely distrust both main parties. It's an incredibly strange atmosphere, and anything could happen. And this is just one symptom of it, I think.
So, Tom, are you suggesting from what you've just said that it would be almost sort of lazy thinking to assume that because Reform votes have gone up, that it's going to hurt the Conservative Party massively and Labour will be the beneficiaries?
I think Reform a particular kryptonite for the Conservative Party because they've got that Nigel Farage element and because of where they've come from being the Brexit party. If you look at who they're taking votes from, it is mostly the Conservatives. So 70%, 7 in 10 of the Reform voters come from Conservatives and only 4% come from Labour. So a tiny, tiny proportion from Labour. And that is why it's total kryptonite from the Conservatives.
Is anyone young voting or intending to vote Reform, or is this just an old people's party?
I have to say, Emily, a bit like the Conservative Party, these Reform voters are quite old. They're ever so slightly younger than the average Conservative, so they're more likely to be in their 50s and early 60s than kind of 65 plus, so they're a bit less likely to be pensioners. They're more likely to still be in work, but they are quite old.
And I guess the question is, do you think that they will actually vote Reform come the general election, or is this the kind of, you know, the sound and fury 6 months before?
So our initial kind of report was met with a bit of scepticism, and people said this is froth, not going to be backed up by by-election votes. And we said probably is, but maybe it will just take some time. Now, these latest developments, I think, you know, we need to let them bed in. We need to see whether this shift is real. I do think there is probably a little bit of froth there. I'm not sure a lot of these new supporters for Reform actually know what the party stands for. I'm not sure Reform have those resources on the ground by their own admission to run a general election campaign, to win in by-elections. So I think it probably is a little bit of froth. See Cleggmania in the past, perhaps. It has that feel to it. But who knows? As I've said, the atmosphere out there is voters looking for someone to support, someone to trust, when, you know, the two main parties really are all at sea.
And when you say that people kind of don't quite know what Reform stands for or not quite sure about all of that, is that an advantage or disadvantage? Like, come a general election, presumably you've got to set out your policies on all manner of different things. And broadly speaking, we know that Reform stand for no net migration.
Yeah, I know. I think you're right that in this world where voters distrust the two main parties, or large groups of voters do, being fresh, being someone who, you know, a party that is untied, unbound to past policies or even a current policy platform can be a really strong thing. And we've seen the Greens benefit from that as well. So you're right that even coming general election, when they announce their policy platform, it may be that they get the benefit of being kind of unknowns to voters.
Tom, you keep saying they don't trust the two main parties. If you go back to the YouGov poll, Labour's on 44%. That looks pretty solid from how I'm looking at it. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think this is the problem with voting intention surveys. And I know we're talking about one right now, but they don't tell you the whole story. So first off, all the people who said they don't know are all discarded in those headline voting intention figures. And there's quite a lot of them still. But even those people who say they're plumping for Labour, the question is, what do they think about Keir Starmer particularly? And then what do they think about the Labour Party? And a good chunk of those 44% are pretty sceptical about both. Now, if things stay as they are, if the election's tomorrow, fine, perhaps Labour get 44% of the vote. But I'm just saying things can change. And if you look ahead, perhaps Labour win a majority. What does that scepticism about Starmer and the Labour Party actually mean for a Labour government, and whether he can maintain his popularity or
and what are the don't knows, just to get your sense of the number there? What is the don't knows number? The
don't knows number is about 17% at the moment. So 17% of people who said they voted last time now say they don't know how they're going to vote, and that is more likely to be Conservative 2019 voters than Labour. It's not enough for the Conservatives. Their position is so parlous that even if all those don't knows came back, it would only help them get kind of slightly back towards Labour.
And Tom, if you've sat in on these focus group studies where people have expressed their disillusionment, they're kind of having lost any sort of anchor with any main political party. If Rishi Sunak rang you up and said, come into number 10 and please tell us what we need to do, what would you tell him?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, part of the problem is that politics and just being in the public eye at the moment, extremely hard. We live in an extremely sceptical age, and the cost of living crisis has been a burning platform for anyone in power anywhere in the world. And you talk about this all the time. From this side of the channel, you'd think Macron was kind of stratospheric levels in the polls. He's actually, on a lower approval rating than Rishi Sunak. Trudeau in Canada, Biden in the US. It's just really hard to be a politician during a cost of living crisis that is still ongoing. I mean, on the positive side for Rishi Sunak, he needs to present himself as some kind of strong leader. He needs to show the public that he actually has a position on stuff. When a new crisis comes along, the Prime Minister needs to take a position and stick to it. And even if it's not the most popular position, he will get credit from the public for actually sticking his neck out and saying what he thinks. The people want honesty. They want politicians who say it how it is. And look at the success of Nigel Farage. Look at the success of Donald Trump. These politicians who speak truth to power.
Tom, very good to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Great stuff. Thanks, Tom.
Great to be with you. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.
Yesterday at Prime Minister's Questions, Rishi Sunak was boasting about how much success the government had had in cutting the number of small boats crossing the channel in kind of exchanges with Keir Starmer. Today, number 10 has said that it is dealing with a migration emergency after a record number of people crossed the English Channel in small boats yesterday. So the timing of the Sunak boast was not exactly ideal, given that we now got a migration emergency.
The timing makes no sense, because if Rishi Sunak wanted to get all this wrapped up and done, he could do it before Easter recess on 2 or 3 days next week. The fact that he isn't, the fact that the Commons will not be able to meet again and vote on this now until after the 15th of April pushes everything backwards and makes you wonder why he is so scared of having lots and lots of Conservative MPs meeting together in a lobby next week. And it kind of points to one thing only, which is, oh my God, the May elections are coming. Please don't start plotting behind my back right now.
Now, Downing Street right now want to get to the Easter recess as quickly as possible and have MPs on the parliamentary estate for as little time as possible. But it does mean, as you say, Emily, that this whole thing gets pushed back. And it is just worth saying what the Lords have done, because there's this thing, the most boring form of ping pong, parliamentary ping pong, where the Lords, they have to agree on the wording of the bill. And if there are amendments inserted in the Lords, it has to go back to the Commons and they vote on those amendments. And there's a certain number of times that they can do that before the Commons gets its way. But, over the course of this week, peers have voted by a majority of over 40 to say that the Rwanda legislation has to have, quote, due regard for domestic and international law. They've backed an amendment by over 40 votes to say that Rwanda is only deemed safe as long as the provisions of the UK's treaty is in place. There are lots of other provisions as well about whether or not Rwanda really is a safe country. So all of this stuff now has to go back to the Commons and it will be sent back again.
Can I just ask, what happens if the Lords do not back down? Because the assumption is that they will yield. They play the ping pong, they try and amend, they try and send their questions about, what they don't agree with, what they're holding out for. What happens if they just don't yield on that?
In the end, the Commons through the Parliament Act gets its way.
The Parliament Act.
So they just say
there's a certain number of times that they can block it within a session and then of Parliament, and then in the end, the Commons gets its way. Normally, the Lords backs down before that because they know that the Parliament Act will be invoked.
Because the question is, I suppose, the Lords, for all its sort of esoteric anachronism, is probably closer to where the majority of the country is on this now than the Commons majority under the Conservative Party, right?
Yeah, maybe.
It's not what we're told.
The Parliament Act, okay, Lewis, the good old Mr. Geekmeister of everything political. I thought
just Canadian constituencies.
I thought the Parliament Act was money bills. You can't block a budget, and the Parliament Act of 1911 could be invoked
But it was changed.
in 49.
It was changed in 49, so now it's any particular provision, so it's not just money bills anymore.
Right.
And in money bills anyway, that they historically they got to the point where the convention would be that the Lords will not.
So they can
oppose
check
it.
and balance, but they can't actually change.
Well, they do. I mean, they do, but like it depends, I suppose, on the will of the Commons. I mean, I actually think we are getting to the point now where the Lords probably should back down, because as much as I actually agree with many of the provisions that they're trying to put in, it's very clear what the will of the Commons is at this point. The will of the Commons is to get this legislation through, rightly or wrongly, in its current form.
And it's also just worth underlining, because I'm sure the Sunak attack will be, Labour, you've tried to block our policies on this, da-da-da-da-da-da. There is a Conservative majority in the House of Lords, where if everyone turns up, it is Conservative peers.
And Labour Lords haven't really.
A number of
really.
Conservative MPs who have been in the vanguard of trying to alter this legislation, because they just believe that it is fundamentally wrong that you put into law saying something is black when it is white.
And I think there, going back to our earlier discussion, is where you have potential two parties. The Conservative Party, it's the arguments that the Lords are making about trying to hold on to the rule of law and conservatism versus whatever Rishi Sunak is trying to do now with a more populist party which wants to creep up to the edges of reform and say, let's just get this done. We'll make Rwanda safe. Black is white.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think that the Lords at this point now, the government will say that they are stretching parliamentary convention. I mean, this is why Labour are making it clear that ultimately within the Lords they're not going to try. They're not going to.
They're not pushing it.
Yeah, exactly, because we can see what the contours of the political attack is going to be. And linking back to our previous discussion as well about the Rishi Sunak's political position and reform, obviously we've had this day where over 500 people have arrived over the channel, and this delay probably means, almost certainly means that there is no way that any flights take off before the local elections. And the local elections are obviously the next big political pressure point for Sunak and his premiership, and the aftermath of that, assuming they are as bad as they are likely to be, because the last time these seats were fought was with Boris Johnson in 2021 with a COVID bounce at his pomp. And with reform polling as they are as well, it could be an absolute, to use a very Trumpian word, an absolute bloodbath.
Yeah, I just on that, a plane taking
Sorry, you're just
off.
talking about the car industry.
Yes, the car industry. Yeah, I'm always talking about the car industry. Yeah, our friends at Honda.
Just so this plane takes off to Rwanda with, I don't know, 200 asylum seekers.
Probably
on
Are
it.
you kidding?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like 17.
10.
Yeah.
Okay, so a huge plane takes off with 10 asylum seekers on it. Is everyone going to go, oh my, this is astonishing. This has changed the way I think about
It
the
allows
government
every
and
single
about the general
minister
election.
to go out and do the rounds and say,
We've got a plan.
We've got a plan, we're up in the air. Just as they do with Albania, to be honest. I mean, the moment anyone starts talking about small boats or about why it hasn't worked, everyone talks about
The
Albania.
Albanian stuff worked.
The Albanian stuff worked because they did it
but has
with
it-
the
Yeah.
concession of the country itself,
But
right?
will it shift the dial? Given the hundreds of millions of pounds that have been spent trying to get this set up. I'm asking this as a question. It doesn't seem to me self-evident that this is something where, when it was Boris Johnson saying get Brexit done in the lead up to 2019, and Brexit gets done, and you can see that, it was a lot of fault with it. You could see why it resonated and people were sick and tired of. But is anyone really going to base their votes on, oh, thank God, a plane has gone to Rwanda?
I think some people, yes, will be looking to the Conservatives to say, please give me a reason, any reason, to help
come
me
back.
not vote Labour. Yeah, I don't really want to vote Labour. I'm not really a Labour supporter. Please give me a reason to tell me that you're now on the up. And it's also, I think, about morale. Isn't it? It's about party morale. Give your foot soldiers, and talking foot soldiers, if the May elections are as bad as you're predicting, there won't be that many people left to knock on doors. But it's a way of saying to your party, here's something. You take this out and go on the airwaves, go to your constituencies and say, this is happening.
Yeah, I think because Labour have, and Starmer and Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, have been so emphatic that even if the policy gets up and running, they will dismantle it and they oppose it. I suppose their hope is it doesn't make much difference for May, how can it? But over the course of the next 6 months, in the run-up to the election, you can just keep hammering the idea that they have a plan and that the Labour Party doesn't. And hopefully, in their absolute, I suppose, ideal world, that there is, even if it is a modest reduction in the number of people arriving, they can point to it and say, we were right. There was a deterrent. And then we were going to expand the scheme. Now, I think in practice, I think it is unlikely to have any particular effect on numbers, and I don't think it will be easy to expand the scheme. But rhetorically, they at least have something to point to. There was another villain of this piece, by the way, just to say, in terms of the House of Lords ping pong, which is our old friend Jacob Rees-Mogg, who seems to have been on a bit of a sort of personal crusade against Baroness Hale, the former president of the Supreme Court. He tweeted today saying, Baroness Hale of Richmond, the former president of the Supreme Court, once again flying her long suspected political colours in support of continued illegal migration. And this follows up a series of tweets that he's made about her in this vein. As if, I mean, and what's so despicable about this is that Rees-Mogg is clever enough to know that that is of course nonsense. The idea that she wasn't an impartial judge, very, very respected judge, a very, very respected legal career across the legal profession, who ended up as president of the Supreme Court, the first woman president of the Supreme Court.
She was our own RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Well, although I actually think, I don't know whether she would demur from that, because she might say that they are more political.
Yeah, fair enough.
But
a pioneer, I suppose.
Totally, or Sandra Day O'Connor, or and this is what people like Rees-Mogg do all the time: is they allied impartiality with the idea of being of a neutrality, of having no opinions
it's
whatsoever.
Simpler than that. She did for him because he was the one pushing the prorogation of Parliament, and she came out on the steps and said, it's unlawful. End of.
Totally. But the point is, she was a judge, and she acted completely properly as a judge. And by the way, during the prorogation, every single judge on the Supreme Court agreed. It was unanimous, and yet weirdly enough, he goes for the woman, always goes for her, as if she was leading the whole thing.
I wish I could think of an American politician who's been president who used to do similar things when judges gave decisions he didn't like. If only I could think of one who might have recently been a president.
She was a judge, she acted totally properly, and now she's a member of the House of Lords and able to exercise her vote as she sees fit. There is nothing improper about that whatsoever. He just doesn't like the decision.
So before we go, nice dress.
Thank you.
That was so predictable as a gag.
Oh, whatever. Well, you know what? I'm doing the best I can with the material that's sent to me, John. What
I woke
can I
up
say?
feeling a little bit Little House on the Prairie today.
Yeah, I can see that. It's lovely.
Yes. There's quite a lot of dirndl going on in the studio right now. I'm channeling, I think, an Amish community of Pennsylvania, perhaps.
Well,
I love it.
How do we describe it? It's a sort of dirndl? No, is that the wrong word?
I feel like it's a word that we should be using more.
I think you need to stand up, Emily, so the cameras, because we're going to put a social clip about this.
I'm not.
You
this
are.
is my dirndl dress.
Yeah.
No, but I have to stay in my rocking chair with knitting on my knees to make it right.
Little broom next to you.
Little broom,
Fantastic.
With
exactly.
the Germans of Pennsylvania.
Children all sort of playing out in the fields and prairies beyond. It's all lovely. You ever been to an Amish community, John?
I have, actually. And and it was quite an interesting visit. And I think the best part about the piece that I did from there was the sign-off.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Well, the town I was in... Well, should I just do the sign-off?
Yeah, go on. We're going back to whatever year it was. It's Pennsylvania. Emily's in the dress.
When the Irish had just arrived
I'm
in
tilling the
Pennsylvania.
fields. Yeah.
John Sopel, BBC News, Intercourse, Pennsylvania.
You were in intercourse.
I was
Mid-intercourse.
Intercourse. And write your own gags, fill them in.
Do you come here often?
Yeah.
What was it like in intercourse, John? What was it like in intercourse? Pleasant?
I withdrew quickly.
All right.
Right, I'm never
time
wearing
for us
this
to make
dress
our own
again.
exit.
Lucky for you. Bye-bye.
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 The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.